Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today are two of my fabulous colleagues, John Tracey and Dan Welch. How you doing, fellas?
Great.
Yeah,
awesome.
doing well.
Dan is coming to us from the great Buckeye state of Ohio, where everything is round on the ends and high in the middle. So we can say hi. And John's coming to us from the breadbasket of the Confederacy, the Shenandoah Valley. So hello to both of you. So
we're looking forward to it.
Yeah, very good.
Not the breadbasket post 64. They solved that one.
Indeed, it's not. This is totally off topic, and I didn't even think I was going to mention anything about this. But John, you've been doing some work in Shenandoah National Park, and you recently had a starlight program because we had the meteor shower recently. I've got to imagine it was just a beautiful spot to be.
Oh, it was gorgeous. You know, there's still some light pollution up there, right? So the modern world peeks in, but it's really something to think about. You know, just the way that people used to experience the world was very different, and getting out into national parks and especially those certified as dark sky parks, though Shenandoah isn't because of some of that encroaching light pollution. Getting out into those places and looking up, it's tying back to the podcast, right? You hear all those things all over the place, and pop culture wise, it's central to Gods and Generals, right? Who could forget the Gods and Generals Fredericksburg scenes of the night sky at Fredericksburg, so well documented during the war, and so poignantly represented in the pop culture there. And getting out into the night sky parks is not only kind of a naturally beautiful thing, but sometimes you can't help but think about, like, well, what did everybody else think about all of this stuff in their own times.
Yeah. So, and Dan, as John was talking, I noticed you took sort of a drink as a toast to the night sky, and you have a Civil War glass there, don't you?
What is left of some of my Civil War sesquicentennial beer mugs? Most of the paint is off of most of them now after years of light use. But this one I've got Grant. One of my least used ones. So.
I had that same cup, and they all were destroyed by the dishwasher. The great battle of the dishwasher, battle of the whirlpool, whatever. I'll clear it away. But that's maybe kind of an interesting entree into our discussion, though, because like here's like glassware with pictures of these generals on them. So it's sort of this way that we're, as consumers, bringing the Civil War into our houses with stuff painted on them, generals painted on them in this instance. And so tell me about that, Dan. Like, we interact with the war in all these ways that most of us maybe aren't even realizing.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's an interesting construct to the idea of pop culture in the Civil War is, the general understanding of popular culture is something that, is all known by the masses, right? But what we know about pop culture is that pop culture changes very, very quickly for the masses. It's not a continual touchstone. But when we talk about pop culture in the Civil War, we have that duality of stuff that reaches the masses. So, for example, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary that came out, on PBS. That was huge for the masses all across the country, but it didn't remain a touchstone for everyone. But it became this, this storied documentary that inspired so many enthusiasts and historians within the the field of not only Civil War studies, but those that are interested in the topic as well. So something as simple as taking a sip of a drink this evening out of a beer mug with Grant's face on it, something that was produced for the masses of the Civil War community as pop culture, not necessarily for the masses of those spread out across the modern day country. So I find that very, very fascinating as to what you said, what those of us in the Civil War community would deem pop culture to us and what we're bringing into our own homes. Everything from, this beer mug I'm drinking out of to a 12-inch soldier right about there on my bookcase holding up my Confederate military histories and then fall off the top to, just a whole
I
host
think
of.
we can see his pants. I think we can see his
Yeah,
pants.
yeah. You got you've got the bottom half there, but it works as a great bookend. But yeah, so I think it's really interesting what we in the Civil War community have termed pop culture to us, and what we end up consuming as consumers within the Civil War community of popular culture. And I would agree with you. I mean, everything from the spear mug to that 12-inch figure I got there, to a couple of Civil War themed shot glasses that line my bookshelves as mementos of places that I've been to music, CDs, records, DVDs, digital media. It really spans the gamut. And I think one of the interesting parts too to this is that pop culture in the Civil War is nothing new, right? So, I can think about my father teaching me some of those um, hex squared Civil War type games from Avon Hill that came out in the 50s or 60s. These are things that are now 60 and 70 years old. So the transference of pop culture or Civil War into gaming and board games and things of that. So it's definitely nothing new, and it's constantly changing, both within the Civil War community and also the population at large.
So our discussion tonight is really kind of based on a book that John and I had co-edited called The Civil War and Pop Culture, as part of the Emerging Civil War 10th Anniversary Series. Oh, look, John's holding up a copy. Got to say something, John, so that the screen goes over to you from me.
Yeah. Sorry, here it is. I didn't want to interrupt, but I wanted to, hold it up in reversed fashion here.
Now, this book has kind of an interesting origin, and I'll apologize to John right up front, because it's like he was working on a book about Civil War monuments in memory, and then discovered he was having twins, because we had so much content that we was talking about memory. And this happened to Dan too, ironically. Geez, I'm the father of two sets of twins. I apologize. And as we were just kind of pulling together content for the Civil War monuments in memory, sort of the pop culture stuff as a form of memory, we've written a lot about it in the blog, and so we just decided to split that off for a book. But John, we see these two books in conversation. Tell me a little bit about from your perspective, where this book came from and how it ties back to Civil War memory.
Yeah, so we were looking at kind of a single volume of ways that people remembered the war, and that included people who experienced the war and wrote about it or memorialized it, and then that included the things that people created around the war, whether at the time, during the war, or after the war, again either by participants, people for which it was within lived memory, and then people decades and a century later. And as we kind of put those things together, we realized that we had a whole lot in both of those categories, right? So we put all the monumentation stuff in one box, and the ways in which a lot, primarily the primary cast remembered the war, into the first volume, and then the ways in which people created art and popular culture in their own ways of remembering the war, whether they had experienced it firsthand or not, kind of into this second volume that just came out a couple of weeks ago here.
Now, it seems to me that pop culture in particular, and Dan mentioned it's nothing new. There's been, lots of instances of popular culture's interaction with Civil War, but it strikes me as a powerful tool for not only remembering the war, but getting people interested in the war. Let me ask each of you to speak to that. John, I'll have you go first, but kind of talk about that role of these pieces of art that not only reflect but also interest people in the war.
Yeah, I think it would be an uncommon student of the war that says, the first thing that got me hooked on the Civil War is Coddington's The Gettysburg Campaign, or some other really academic text about the Civil War. A lot of people get to that point, and a lot of people really enjoy that. But that's usually not where people start. They'll start, maybe on a family trip to a battlefield, or they'll start because they heard a song, or they saw a TV show, or they saw a movie, or they saw Ken Burns, right? The popular culture touchstones, especially, films and television, tend to have a broader audience and tend to be kind of that gateway, that first thing you do. And then, yeah, maybe you get to the big academic books. Some people do, not everybody does. Other people engage with the war in different ways. But very few people kind of jump right out of the gate with university press books, right? You probably started somewhere else. I sure did.
Yeah. Dan, talk to me about pop culture as a gateway drug.
Yeah, I think it's a very powerful gateway drug, and I think one of the reasons why it's so powerful is because perhaps the most popular of all pop culture within the Civil War community is all visual or digital media, right? So the big touchstones are movies, documentaries, music, most oftentimes soundtracks that associated these movies or documentaries. And then for a number of years, Civil War paintings, works like Mort Kunstler, Antrioni, and those in that field. But I tend to agree with John that Civil War pop culture as a touchstone for many of us still within the Civil War community was almost a secondary reaction, that our first experience was perhaps a battlefield visit, perhaps a story about ancestors around a family gathering, and that the real touchstone which supported that initial interest or engagement was pop culture. And that's for me as well. My first engagement was a trip to the Gettysburg battlefield, and out of the Gettysburg battlefield trip came some of those touristy type shops downtown. And at the ripe age of 5, my parents purchasing a kepi and a toy musket, the battlefield became, alive for me. And then that was quickly followed by, years later, Glory and, Ken Burns and Gettysburg and all of these pop culture icons within the field of Civil War studies. So, I think that you have to have both. I think you won't ensnare someone in this field in an engaging way with just a battlefield visit or just seeing a movie or a painting. That they go hand in hand with how we consume and remember history today in the late 20th and early 21st centuries.
I think if we, kind of rewind our timeline, and we could probably go all the way back to Birth of a Nation, Griffin's silent movie based on the book The Klansman, or Gone with the Wind. And those two pieces of cinema had huge influences on the wider culture. And for some people, that's as far as they ever got with Civil War. Like that those things helped define what the Civil War was for them. And for generations, it did so, which is in many ways problematic. So there's sort of this dark side to the influence of pop culture too. John, tell me a little bit about, what are some of the dangers that are inherent in that?
Yeah, I think it's the classic, and this is where some people kind of get reactionary against pop culture of like, oh well, everything is simplified into a fiction book like Killer Angels, Gods and Generals, Last Full Measure. Oh, it's been simplified into the movie Gettysburg, the film Glory, though Glory's definitely heads and shoulders above some of these others as well. But the idea that in order to translate to popular audiences or to be best-selling books or blockbuster movies, things get simplified a little bit because history is a very complicated thing that does not always, merit easy condensation into 200 pages or an hour and a half in a theater, right? And some people, go very reactionary against that of like, oh well, these aren't accurate. And there's kind of that line of like, okay, well, they're not designed to be documentary films, right? Some things they get right, some things they don't get right, and that's okay for the type of media that they are. And there are a lot of great writers and historians and researchers who started out, getting picked up, Dan's got a piece on the soundtrack of the movie Gettysburg in the book, and then we have actually two more pieces also related to the film. And is the film Gettysburg a perfect recreation of 3 days in July of 1863? No. Is it a cultural touchstone for the ways that many people interact with the Battle of Gettysburg? Absolutely. Although maybe the film would have you think that the only thing that happened on July 2nd was Little Round Top and Culp's Hill didn't exist, and neither did approximately half of the Army of the Potomac. But man, I still turn that sucker on most battle anniversaries. I mean, you still got to do it, right? Because it's that thing that hooks you. I remember, I may only be 26, but I still remember flipping that two VCR tape set in and being like, oh, I gotta go change the VCR tape. Which now I feel like I'm just kind of bullying you guys by being like, oh, VCR tape.
I remember when they didn't have sound in movies.
I think John brings up two really good points, and I think both of them will tie into my next thought, which, he talks about the dark side, what you mentioned, of popular culture. From everything, using the movie Gettysburg as an example, you have those that are that can become inspired by it, to dig deeper, to go into the field in a more professional way, whether being, a teacher of history or a professor at the collegiate level or public historian or working in the museum field. But then you have those that are like, well, this didn't happen like this, and that uniform is Farby, and they wouldn't have said it like this, and their accents and their beards are bad, and they really poo-poo the overall effect of the movie. And I think in my own personal journey, I kind of was the same way, that I absolutely fell in love with a lot of the pop culture coming out in regards to the Civil War in the 1980s, before John was even born, and into the early 90s, also before John was born. But then as I kind of entered this field and dug deeper and started learning more and researching more, it became very negative to those things, almost from an education standpoint. Well, now I've got to reteach people that this was not how it was, and this is not what it would have looked like, and this is what was forgotten. But to my secondary point in John's comments is that I've kind of come full circle now and have come back to embrace it, because what I have seen in the public history field as it relates to the Civil War is we have lost many of those popular culture touchstones that brought an awareness and an understanding and at least some sort of foundation to the masses of what this period was all about. So this year commemorates or celebrates the 30th anniversary of the movie Gettysburg. 15, 16 years ago, when I started as an interpreter at Gettysburg, most every person that came on a public program on that battlefield had seen parts of or all of the movie Gettysburg. And that is very rare now. In 2021, 22, 23, few, or in some cases, some public programs, no one on those programs has seen the movie Gettysburg. So, pop culture is being cyclical. And I think, as I mentioned, me coming back full swing on this, full circle on this, it's a nice way to get folks back engaged with the Civil War. And although not perfect, at least gets them interested into this time period, which the ultimate goal of all of our positions is to transition these folks from, casual observers and folks of casual interest to those that want to become stewards of this story and these physical places and this material culture.
Yeah. And, when I worked at Fredericksburg in Spotsylvania, people would come in the door and they'd be like, oh, I saw the movie Gettysburg, and now I want to go see where Stonewall Jackson died. And Stonewall Jackson wasn't in the movie Gettysburg, but, they came through the door and it got them there. And to me, like, that was an opportunity. And, I would have colleagues who would roll their eyes like, oh, damn. And like, as pieces of history, some of those movies are terrible, but as pieces of art, and I think more importantly, as pieces of inspiration, they got someone through the door, and now it's up to me. I now have an opportunity that I would not have had as an interpreter to give them the story and help them explore it and learn more, which I think was, was vital. I wouldn't have the chance to talk to those people if it wasn't for that movie. So,
Absolutely.
I think we're sort of talking about, maybe two different layers of artifacts or texts here, where within the Civil War community there are these touchstones like Gettysburg, like Gods and Generals, like the Killer Angels, and then there are sort of this other layer where these texts transcend the Civil War community, and that might be Ken Burns' Civil War, where all of America tuned in for a week to watch it. Gone with the Wind, where who doesn't love Scarlet and Rat? Even the Civil War Centennial, which was so interactive on such a wide scale for so many people. Tell me how you kind of how do you view those really big moments that have influenced the cultural understanding of the Civil War, and has that been good or bad? John?
I think that some of them have been more harmful than others. Birth of a Nation stands out as one of those ones that, very popular at its time, and very much something that negatively impacted race relations in America and the ways in which people embraced, lost cause portrayals, to misremember Reconstruction and misremember the realities of the Civil War. Gone with the Wind is also something that throws around a couple lost cause-y tenets here and there, and certainly is something that had huge influences on that. But then you get to other things where you get to, I mentioned Glory earlier. Glory, again, not perfect, misrepresents a couple things here and there, but gets all of those broad strokes very right, and is something that was a big popular movie that I think had a big positive influence in bringing to light new types of stories that had not gotten the type of attention throughout much of the 1900s. So they're all a mixed bag, except I do have trouble finding value in Birth of a Nation, other than looking at it in a vacuum as an object of interest by being one of the first pseudo blockbuster films. I try to look at it in that vacuum, but having sat through the entirety of it a couple of times, it's hard to find it's hard to find value in its portrayal of the Civil War.
As a communications guy, I always find that such a troubling movie, because as a piece of art, it was groundbreaking, and the cinematography in it was incredible, and the direction, and the content is just so awful and historically, and I think morally problematic in such awful ways. So here you've got this piece of art that, as a piece of art, is really important in art history or film history, but as a piece of history, oh my gosh, it's just terrible. Dan, tell me kind of your thoughts about these big touchstone, large cultural artifacts or texts.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, that I've kind of returned back, full cycle to the importance of these pieces within pop culture and the Civil War community. And even as using Birth of a Nation as an example of one that has that duality of a touchstone in pop culture, but one with a dark side, if you will, in regards to what we can glean from it. I'm of the opinion that all of these touchstones are important, and what even for what they are in the era in which they come out, and what they inspire or don't inspire in that period in which they kind of burst into the scene and become popular. Gone with the Wind certainly portrays a very distinct type of perspective among the South and Confederates during the war, as well as damned Yankees. I think you see the pendulum swing dramatically by the time we get to the 1980s, and even in the 1970s, when you're looking at Sam Waterston playing Lincoln and Gore Vidal's Lincoln to North and South and Blue and Gray TV miniseries to even Ken Burns is landmark documentary that, as you mentioned, the masses of this country tuned in for, not just your history buffs and your history teachers and professors, but even something as that has that duality as well. Ken Burns relies heavily on Shelby Foote, and Shelby Foote becomes almost this iconic historian, if you will, of the Civil War following that documentary. But, is Shelby Foote a true historian, or is he a storyteller? Pick up any of his works and look for the footnotes, look for the sources. Where is he getting this stuff? Then at the same point in time, we had Glory come out, which, as I wanted to interrupt you so bad, John, you said it gets a lot of things right, except, the direction in which they charge the fort itself,
Well, I always had trouble just like Ferris Bueller being in the movie. It's like, oh.
All I could see was Princess Bride the entire time. Elvis. But, getting back to that, this kind of discussion, this thread, what concerns me now in the 21st century is I don't see those popular culture touchstones anymore. No one is coming to, a Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Visitor Center or a Gettysburg Visitor Center or a Cedar Creek Visitor Center and saying, I just watched, 2008 or 2007's The Conspirator, and I want to see, this, or I saw 2014's Copperhead, and I want to see, these attempts at either direct Civil War stories or stories in art that have a tangential relation to the Civil War are so below the radar now, that I fear we're going to have a generation or two that's not going to have the same spark that the generation from the Centennial era did, and the generation from the 1980s and early 90s did, that really catapulted a lot of people's interest into the Civil War as a direct result to those pieces of popular culture.
Yeah, I'm trying to think like what the last big thing was that really captured America's attention. I know that there was a lot of hope that the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary, would do that, and it really didn't kind of gel the way the centennial had. And can either of you think of like, what you would say like the last big pop culture moment for the Civil War was?
We had Lincoln. I think Lincoln did okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I think, I love that film.
Me too.
It's maybe a little more political focus than most representations of the Civil War in art, but it has some great, siege scenes towards the beginning and the like. So I mean, I have trouble thinking, Dan mentioned Copperhead, that didn't really go anywhere. I don't think Will Smith's recent movie really went anywhere either.
Right.
So I think it's got to be Lincoln, right?
Yeah, I think so.
For blockbuster movies, I think it's Lincoln.
Yeah, I totally would agree with you, John. I think that not only the movie, but Clarence Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals, in which the movie's based upon, really entered popular culture. I mean, it was at every bookstore as a bestseller, and she was being interviewed on everything from morning news outlets to NPR book talks to even doing events throughout the sesquicentennial, being the main speaker, one of which was at Gettysburg. So I would tend to agree. And the other thing I think of that though is I think about not just movies, right? Because we've talked very heavily on movies, and I think that they've had the biggest impact in the popular cultural realm within the Civil War community. But if we start looking at other things that have been produced for the masses in the Civil War community, at the same time you had Glory and Ken Burns and Gettysburg come out, you had, I can't remember the name of them, but they were very similar to those 12-inch figures that were in all the gift shops, styled after different uniforms, and the small Britons figures and the plastic Civil War army men that had been around from the 60s. And there was so much other stuff in which you could engage in the popular culture of the Civil War, but I don't even see that anymore as well. Particularly I see more tourist tourist places, if you will, places for tourists in which to shop and engage with Civil War pop culture, for actual physical consumer goods. They're pivoting to where markups higher, fudge and bottles of water and candy and things like that. So not only am I not seeing those big Civil War touchstones in movie format into the 21st century, but also with those other, physical products in which not the general masses, but at least the Civil War masses would engage with as well. It just seems to me that there was so much more during these other periods of important touchstones.
As you talk about that, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head. If we think about the way just social media has really kind of funneled us into very narrow, specialized niches, the magazine industry is geared towards specialized niches. Media in general. There's a cable TV channel for anything anymore. When back in the Ken Burns days, there weren't that many TV channels, and so like media itself has just become so much specialized, and marketing has become so much specialized that maybe some of these things you're talking about are just geared toward those hardcore Civil War communities and not that larger, which might be why there aren't those larger touchdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also relevant to all of these touchdowns that we've talked about tonight. Those that are that lived through those touchdowns or were inspired by those touchdowns, that demographic is aging out.
Yeah.
I don't see, I see a shift in engagement to where you would have that demographic not only engaged in pop culture, but also going to these historic sites and buying books and reading and having a very well-versed knowledge of this time period. I have seen that shift where that age group, that demographic is not leaving the hobby, but not as active as they used to be, to now seeing those more families, younger audiences, which is great. But the challenge of, and perhaps I should not say challenge, and opportunity, is that they're coming with no touchstone, with no previous engagement, and therefore no previous foundational knowledge. We saw the brown sign on the highway. It said Civil War battlefield. The kids have been in the car 5 hours. We want to get them out of the car. So,
been there.
But yeah, so that's an opportunity. It's definitely an opportunity for us in the public history field, right? But we only have them for that limited, that time that they're there, the 45 minutes, the 3 hours. That time they're there is the spark that we generate enough in that limited window to keep them going when they leave. Or the days of when you could turn on the Discovery Channel or the History Channel and there were always syndicated reruns of Civil War Journal that would carry you through to the next book you got or the next battlefield trip. Are those popular culture touchstones that are absent, is that going to be detrimental to the new demographics that are engaging in this era of history?
Mm-hmm. I think about, the content, the digital content, which is something you brought up earlier, like the American Battlefield Trust creates a tremendous amount of digital content that is something that a lot of folks in the community engage with. How much does it break out of the community? Again, kind of going back to that notion of being in these niches. Now, Dan, I know, and John, this is kind of a question for you, having come along after us. Dan and I are of a certain age, and I'm of a more certain age than Dan is. But Dan, once upon a time, I know that you would you have the CDs in the car that were playing Civil War music, and you've got your action figure on the bookshelf, and you're drinking from a Civil War glass, and you've got Civil War art on the walls. And I would immerse myself. Yeah, look at that. He's the cleanest Confederate I have ever seen.
He's propping up my light.
And I would sort of bathe myself in Civil War stuff that way as well. John, did you ever do that kind of stuff? Did you bathe in the Civil War like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to a lesser extent, I had I had a poster, from the battlefield of Gettysburg, with the couple of the sites on it. I had the poster of that hanging up. Behind me, that painting there, that's a wartime painting by Frederick Church. He paints it in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, and it's kind of a flaming sunset sky, that's showing the American flag, right? So, it's not quite pop culture. It's wartime culture there, but I'm still. But I guess looking back, I had some of the kitschier stuff as a kid, so it was around. Certainly Dan and I have spent a lot of time, over the last couple of years, chatting about or rewatching the movie Gettysburg. So that stuck around a bit for me as well.
So what's the kitschiest thing you had, Dan? I'll ask you this too. What do you think the kitschiest thing is?
Start with Dan there, and
okay. The kitschiest thing I had, to give you guys time to think, I have a wine stopper that is shaped like Stonewall Jackson, which is doubly ironic because he didn't drink, but he's going to be stopping up my bottle. There he stands like a stone wall, keeping that wine in the bottle.
Are you sure it doesn't spill out? I mean, he's missing one arm. That's definitely
that's right. He's only got one arm to hold it together. He's that good. He's that good.
Yeah, wow, the kitschiest thing. I mean, just even looking around at my bookshelves here,
but you have like 2.5 years or 3 years of Zoom meetings, so you have curated your bookshelf so it looks distinguished and important. So I would think that you have probably moved the kitsch off the shelves.
I've got a good display of it. I've got I want to say I was really into like action figures as a kid, so any of that kind of stuff. So I think one of my kitschiest things was, and thank the Lord my father has passed almost 10 years ago, so he won't hear this story, but one of our first trips to Gettysburg, he got me this plastic cannon, which I still have on my shelf somewhere, and it had these little plastic nubs that were supposed to be 10-pound parrot shells, and you'd put it down the barrel and you would pull the spring-loaded cascabel back and let it go, and it would fire it. And I think the first night in the hotel that we had that, and it was Larson's Hotel that we were at. I'll never forget that. On the floor, I had some of those Britain's figures, and I played the crap out of that thing till the spring broke. And I never told mom and dad, because we were a lower working class family, so a purchase like that was a big purchase. So I had to pull the little cascabel back and then flick it forward for it to fire. And then after that trip, I really didn't play with it much because I broke it. But that's probably the kitschiest thing I have. I have a lot of the plastic Civil War figures. I have a lot of those Britain's rubber figures. Some of these 12-inch figures. And then of course, as you get older and your taste change, it moved into kitschy Civil War beer glasses and shot glasses. Yeah. So I can sit here and have a shot from a Civil War Trails shot glass, or my Shriver Saloon shot glass from Gettysburg. So those are I would say probably the kitschier things, are the toys, the children's ephemera, if you will, of Civil War pop culture. All right, John, let's
hear. Yeah. So you bought me time because I was looking around, and my bookshelves mostly have like original Civil War artifacts on it now. Yeah. But I think it's got to be, you guys remember Boyd's Bears when it was still in Gettysburg?
Oh yeah.
So Boyd's Bears, big like teddy bear company used to own this big barn outside of Gettysburg. And they made a bear that had its own little like artillery shell jacket on, little happy, full Union uniform. Yeah, I got one of those suckers upstairs for sure.
Awesome. Very good.
I mean, it's impossible. It's an impossible question. I don't know about for you, John, but like I'm even looking at my desk, like who has a flash drive that's Abraham Lincoln? Okay, I mean,
wow, like, that's a lot right there. That's a lot.
I mean, that's pretty kitsch. I mean, like, it's hard to pick. It's a really difficult question.
So let's do a quick little round robin about some of our favorites. We'll start with movies. Best and worst Civil War movie, and why?
Wow. All right, John, as you finish your drink, that gave you a pause there to think about. We'll let you go.
That's the pause that refreshes.
Yeah. I mean, I think I give best to Glory for trying to do something that other, it's I'm not going to say that the 54th Massachusetts has ever been an untold story of the Civil War, right? But for them to dedicate a film to something like that rather than something like, oh well, you make a movie about the Battle of Gettysburg at that time, obviously it's going to sell, right? So I think that Glory kind of took that and pointed things in another direction, and so I think I give Glory best. And despite me being able to look at the film Gettysburg with rose tinted glasses, I cannot do the same for Gods and Generals. Gods and Generals is just over sentimentalized.
No,
schlock, man. Like,
that's Bud Wobson's masterpiece. Come on, man.
Well, but like the book is okay. Like the book Gods and Generals, is fine. But I have again, we were talking about how we try to find value in the things, and that's something to note, right? Like, I know we focused a lot about movies, but we cover like other things in the book too that aren't just movies. Like, we got video games, we got board games, we got.
Oh, we're gonna get to them in a second, I promise.
But the other idea being, like, this isn't just, here's Glory, here's all the things that are right, here's all the things that are wrong, here's Gettysburg, here's the things that are right, here's the things that are wrong. That's not what we're doing in the edited volumes here. But yes, so I have trouble. I have trouble with Gods and Generals, man.
Okay. Yeah. I thought Stephen Lang's portrayal of Jackson was spot on. I mean, the rest of the movie I thought was dreadful, but I actually thought he did a good job of that. Dan, best and worst?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to kind of go similar to what John was talking about, in which I'm going to go with best as the movie Andersonville. I definitely, yeah, deep cut. I would definitely, I would love to put Gettysburg up there. That'll always be a touchstone for me. But, similarly to what John was saying is that, Andersonville depicts a part of the Civil War that is not much discussed, both in academia and within popular culture, and that's the prisoner of war experience. So that was one of those really good touchstones, one of those good movies for me that helps expand that story, right? So in the 21st century and within the last decade, we're all about, in the history field, expanding the stories and looking for new stories and sharing new stories, and I think Andersonville does that within the Civil War popular culture. Worst movie, I've got to say, I want to believe it was called The Gray Ghost. And
there's a TV show about it.
Yeah, there's a TV show about it, but there was a really terrible movie called Gray Ghost, and it was how these Union and Confederates were fighting each other, and all of a sudden, like, a zombie outbreak occurred, and the Union and Confederates had to join forces, and they had to make silver bullets. They had to cast silver bullets and defend this gold wagon train. It was just, it's so far-fetched. Like, I'll take Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter.
Yeah, right.
I was about to say, can I change my best movie to that one? The best movie to Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer, where the Battle of Gettysburg was because of silver.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it's not Gray Ghost, it's The Gray Knight. And what was so disappointing about it is it came out the same year as Gettysburg, right? So, oh man, I'm on the Civil War train right now, with all of these guys, and the worst part about it is it has this huge star-studded cast. Among them, Martin Sheen, is playing a Confederate officer. Corbin Burnson is in there. Like Ray Watt, like all of these. Billy Bob Thornton's in this movie. David Arquette. So like Matt LeBlanc, like all of these huge stars are in this movie, right? And it comes out the same year as Gettysburg, and I'm like, oh, this is, yes, Martin Sheen's a Confederate again. This is going to be awesome. And yeah, next thing it was these guys fighting off Civil War soldier zombies. It was horrible. Horrible. So worst Civil War movie of all time.
Well, it sounds so bad that it would be good. Except that it's so bad it's bad.
Yeah, I owned it on DVD for a number of years, and every now and again I'd get it out and watch it. Even Martin Sheen couldn't save that one.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, so some would say he couldn't even save Gettysburg, but so I think like if I'm going to pull a technicality and I'm going to say Ken Burns' Civil War because it says a film by Ken Burns. So that's going to be my favorite. And of course, had huge impact. It's just beautiful to watch. I love the music. The narrations were just so effective. So I thought it just did a lot to bring the Civil War. As far as worst, I don't know. I might go with Gods and Jacksons. As much as I like Stephen Lang's performance, and I think it is superior. Of all the Civil War performances, I think his as Jackson is the best. But there's so much else about that movie that is so soaked in Magnolias and Moonlight that it's just it's tough to get through. Civil War in real time. That's what I always call it. It was just so slow paced. So you're gonna add something there, Dan? Looked like you wanted to chime in.
I was gonna say that. I mean, how can you give that movie such a bad rating when you get to watch Dennis Fry tell Joshua Chamberlain that it's time to pull off the battlefield, or to see Gabor Borit, waving off the defeated Federal Irish at Marie's Heights. I mean, there's so many Civil War luminaries in that film. Some of these historians that were also touchstones themselves.
True. There was that whole generation of Civil War rock stars.
Civil War rock stars, and they were, they were playing it out in these movies. So it was like a 2-for-1. How many historians could you identify in this movie?
All right, so let's shift to books. Favorite Civil War book. It could be fiction or nonfiction. Let's go with fiction. Let's go with fiction.
I'm gonna go with pretty much, and it could be a collection of, but anything Ambrose Bierce.
Oh
yeah.
I think he was really. I think for a long time it was very in vogue to select him from the fiction pile, but it kind of faded away. I would say probably within the last 20 years. So anything Bierce is good, particularly an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, and then therefore perhaps there's a couple different adaptations of that. Some of my favorite cinema has been some of the adaptations of that. So favorite fiction writer for sure, Bierce, but because of the contemporary experience of Bierce, I think it ties in well.
Okay. A great Twilight Zone episode based on episode of Owl Creek Bridge. Yeah.
Yes.
John, favorite Civil War fiction?
Yeah, well, he stole my beer, so I'm frantically eyeballing through my bookshelves. But Bierce is kind of that fascinating blend of fiction, but like lived fiction, right? Where you can tell that a lot of the stuff that's making its way into the stories is coming from his served experience. And then of course, he's such a mysterious figure himself, basically just vanishing. Himself. I mean, again, kind of in that almost Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane's not quite lived experience, but I think that's a classic. That's a classic fiction that's hard to beat, I think.
Everyone should reread Red Badge if they've read it.
Yeah.
Go reread it. If you haven't, go read it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. So I think my choice is going to be Killer Angels. I think it's just a lovely book, well written. A lot of people knock it because it's fiction, but and he does take a few liberties. But I think it's just a beautiful book that holds up well to this day. So, is there a creative nonfiction writer that you guys particularly like? Dan, you mentioned earlier Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's just straight up nonfiction. I think James McPherson's Red Badge, Battle Cry of Freedom kind of falls in that same category. But then you sort of get into like the Bruce Cattons, the Shelby Foots. Anybody there jump out at you?
Well, I would put Shelby Foote in the fiction category. And I know that's gonna give me some hate email, but when it would be irresponsible to say that popular culture in the Civil War community that has this dark side of people saying this is inaccurate, the uniforms are Farby, the beards are fake, but not then look at something like Ken Burns and Shelby Foote and then look at his research and writing. Where does a lot of these sources come from? Is he a storyteller? Is he a historian? But creative, creative nonfiction writer. Wow, that is man, what I like is not creative. When we started this coming full circle, John was like, who gets into the Civil War and picks up Coddington and loves it? And that's this right here. Like, I absolutely love that experience.
Well, but you didn't start with Coddington because you weren't reading Coddington at age 5, I assume.
That is true. I can actually tell you.
You might have been chewing on Coddington.
Yeah. So my creative nonfiction authors, could be considered very dry. But give me a second. Let me think about it.
All right, very good, very good.
Well, here, I'll buy you some time, Dan. Tony Horwitz. I think that.
Oh yeah.
That I was racking my brain. I'm like, what does creative nonfiction mean? What is that like? Where does that fit? Confederates in the Attic, his John Brown book. His most recent and final books. Yeah, I think that's got to be creative nonfiction, right?
Yeah, Confederates in the Attic is just an outstanding book.
Yeah, I think John even touches on something by calling out Horowitz, which I love your assessment there, John. I completely agree with you. Is talking about popular history and popular historians within the field of the Civil War community and Civil War studies. There are those authors in the history field and abroad that they are, what we call popular historians. They write very human interest, narrative-driven books that are not necessarily for your deep researcher or your content expert, but these are the type of gateway type books on those particular topics. So, you look at like a Kearns Goodwin, for example, or even I would consider a Jim McPherson, a popular Civil War historian. So I'm going to follow up with that. You've inspired me, John, that my creative nonfiction writer, I'm going to say William C. Davis. Davis is one of those human interest, narrative driven, and he ties into so many other areas of the Civil War rock star within the popular culture community of the Civil War, from all the documentaries and Civil War Journal and, the Time Life series. He wrote a number of those. Time Life Civil War series, which was also that's a popular Civil War culture type book, the Mail Away Civil War Time Life series. So I'm going to go with William C. Davis.
Yeah, I know a lot of our listeners are going to be talking about Bruce Catton as kind of what got them hooked, or particularly around the centennial. I love Shelby Foote as a writer, just a fantastic writer. But I'm going to go with Confederates in the Attic as my choice. It's just one of my absolute favorite books. It's fantastic. All right, so how about music? Is there a song, a band, some sort of musical act that really resonates with you?
Gettysburg soundtrack, hands down. As a musician, I love to hate it. As a young kid, that when I got into it, I got a great essay in the book in there that both of you so lovingly went through and made it appear its best. Yeah, gosh, we got that thing on. It was called cassettes, John, and it was this piece of plastic that
you got your little pencil to rewind it.
Yeah, yes. And, we bought that. That was probably our second or third trip down there when the movie was filming and it had come out and the soundtrack was on cassette. And that back then there was no 15 north out of Gettysburg up to the turnpike, so it was the old way going to 30 from Ohio, and it was like a 6.5-hour drive back then. And so I burned the heck out of that thing on the way home after we bought it. But then once I got into music and went to music school and became a music teacher and realized, oh, well, that entire soundtrack is played on a synthesizer. There's literally one person playing every single part, and it's horrible MIDI files that are used. And those are the people as a real musician that you come to loathe because they put real musicians out of work. But that soundtrack, hands down, is such a huge touchdown for me. I really don't care that it's not real musicians. They, a couple of composition companies, music companies have put out, real versions of the soundtrack for middle school and high school, and it just sounds cool, because you just come to hear this synthetic version of these instruments. So Very long-winded answer to saying Gettysburg soundtrack, hands down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the Gettysburg soundtrack is definitely a touchstone. I was also debating the Ken Burns soundtrack, right? But there's also a lot of great modern recordings of wartime songs, right? Some of my favorite, and this is Pete Seeger did a couple albums of re-recording of original Civil War music. Just that folk singer, and I mean, because of his own like social and political activism, like the songs that he picks, you know that he's understanding the message behind them because he's seeing them as the same message that he's putting in his own protest music, throughout. I think that's just such an interesting layer to add to original wartime music and just the great American folk music tradition.
I'll give a little plug there for Ashokan Farewell from the Ken Burns soundtrack. It's a song anytime I hear, I never turn it off, and it's just a lovely song. And then I love Steve Earle's Dixieland, which it's a basically a song about Buster Kilrain from the Killer Angels, and just man, it was a great tune. Toe tapper for sure. So
I'll share one quick story with you. Chris so graciously put this up on our Facebook page a number of months ago. I'm a huge Southern rock guy. Leonard Skinner is the greatest band of any genre of all time. But I've really, over the last couple of years, kind of branched out. Who were their influences? Who else were playing at the same time? And for our listeners, perhaps many of you have heard of the Outlaws, Green Grass and High Tides Forever. But one of the founding members of the Outlaws is a guy by the name of Henry Paul. And Henry Paul left the Outlaws after their third album, and he went on to form the Henry Paul Band. But in 1986, the original Outlaws came back together again and did an album. They cut it out in Los Angeles, which was their first mistake, a Southern rock band going out to LA to record. But they cut this album out, and on the album is a song called Cold Harbor, and it's about the fighting in June of '64. And so this past summer, back in just about a month ago, up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Henry Paul, the only surviving original member from the Outlaws, they've all passed, and his reconstituted band that he calls the Outlaws came to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, just north of Gettysburg. I'm like, well, I'm going. I mean, open them up for him is Artemis Pyle, which was the second drummer for Skinner, and so saw him again. So anyway, so Henry Paul and the reconstituted Outlaws, they played about an hour and a half of like really rocking music, and they all get out the acoustic guitars, and they come out on stage. Well, we're going to slow things down for you, and he starts talking about this next song. We went out to L.A. and I'm like third row. I didn't even let the guy finish. I was like, Cold Harbor, like I'm yelling that out, and sure enough, they played Cold Harbor, and everyone in the audience was just looking at me like, how'd that guy know that song? We've never heard that before. But for Henry Paul, he's a huge Civil War enthusiast, and if you look at a lot of his songs he wrote in his solo career, with the Henry Paul Band, he formed a country band in the early '90s, whose name escapes me at the moment. But they're all, you want to talk about Civil War pop culture and its influence on people, absolutely. So Cold Harbor, there it is, right after the Gettysburg soundtrack.
Charlie Watts, the drummer for the Rolling Stones, was a huge Civil War fan. He had a giant collection of Civil War memorabilia before he passed away.
Like Phil Collins with the Alamo, huge collection
of
Alamo-related stuff. I guess when you got disposable income.
Yeah.
I heard that Phil Collins bought the Alamo's basement, which is why it wasn't there for Pee Wee Herman to find. So the book also talks about other ways, other examples of pop culture. We've got gaming, video gaming, Civil War art, reenactments. What other favorite way do you each have to kind of interact with the Civil War on a sort of arts entertainment level?
Sure, I'll go first. For many years, like I said, the '90s particularly, anything Mort Kunstler I was all about. So the number of posters that I have, it wasn't as a teenager able to afford prints during that time period, but Kunstler definitely, and then Troy Only in the late '90s, early 2000s had huge impact. So, for many, many years until bookcases replaced wall space, I engaged in Civil War pop culture with a lot of art, living history and reenacting, did that as well, at different stages, and went from the general mainstream, what I like to call hoot and shoot, just go out and burn black powder, to doing more research-based living history events with organizations that are similarly minded to do their research. So I've interacted that way as well. And then certainly music, not just, as we talked a little bit about music related to or of the Civil War, but, those songs that have been written in the 20th and 21st centuries about the Civil War, but not necessarily contemporary or period related music, is definitely another way. And then I would say lastly, twofold board games as a kid. I can remember that Civil War trivia game. That was like a board game, and you advanced your around the board for Civil War trivia. And then the Avon Hill Gettysburg game, that was huge. And then all of those plastic toy soldiers and toy cannons. Not much anymore, but I can envision one day having a child of my own and laying on the floor, a boy or a girl, having my plastic Irish Brigade attack some stone plastic wall with Confederate soldiers behind it. So
we have that in my house. That happens here. John, how about you?
I think I'll give it to the board gaming, the war gaming, and the video gaming. All in kind of various levels, right? I'm staring at my copy of Battle Cry. I recently backed on Kickstarter a board game about the Mexican-American War. Very excited about that one. I'll share you the link later because I think you'll like it. Or the miniature war gaming, which is probably just an evolution of, like you guys said, playing with the plastic figures. And then, and we've got a little like summary article of it in the book too. There's a moderate Civil War video game scene out there. I mean, I remember playing the History Channel's official Civil War game maybe 15 years ago. Now that thing was god awful. I'm pretty sure they put a Gatling gun on Little Round Top, if I remember correctly. That was pretty bad, but there's some strategy level ones and other things that are fairly recent, come out within the last couple of years. And then we were talking about kind of cultural touchstones, and one thing that I found really interesting, I never did get around to writing a blog post on it just because life got in the way. And I'm several years late to it, right? But I recently did a playthrough of Red Dead Redemption 2. Now that's set in a fictionalized American West, decades after the Civil War. But I couldn't help but think about all of the ways that the writers and designers for the game considered the American Civil War in it. In one part you're in basically a fictionalized Louisiana-esque landscape, and there's a big old Confederate monument right in the center of the town circle, and there's the dueling family feuds of plantation families that never really recovered from the Civil War. There are the pseudo KKK going around. There are gangs wearing Confederate uniforms perpetuating violence. There are wounded veterans who had amputations, begging for change. And so, well, it's not really a Civil War video game. I think it's a moderate sized cultural touchstone that has sold tens of millions of copies, whether on PCs or consoles. And I think it really still engages with the Civil War. So that's kind of the recent one. I was late to it. But I really enjoyed, going through and occasionally having those moments of like, wait a second, this is talking about the legacy of slavery. This is talking about, the Civil War's impact on the West, which I know several people in ECW are always kind of harping to the rest of us about like, hey, look, there's a West.
Well, John, you may have been a little late to that one, but you're a lot late to probably one of Chris and I's favorite Civil War electronic games or computer games, Sid Meier's.
Oh, yeah.
You did not play Sid Meier's Gettysburg or Antietam, or the demo of South Mountain. You missed out, man.
I think I had that. I think I had that somewhere. I'd have to dig through a stack of, CDs somewhere.
Those were the days where you had to go to MS-DOS and type in code to launch your game.
Oh, the pixelation.
Yeah. Oh, the pixelation. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So, John, I hope that you write that blog post. That would be fantastic.
I am staring at a sticky note on my wall that says like, hey, you should get back to this thing. There's a lot of sticky notes on that. But you know how it goes.
I do. So I'll put in a plug for the second South Carolina String Band, Bobby Horton. I used to love those CDs with Bobby Kincaid. I'd go to a battlefield and I'd pop one in the CD player in the car to kind of soak it in as I was driving around and be in the mood. And just I used to love to listen to those guys. And it was really cool the first time I saw the second South Carolina String Band live, and they were just absolutely electric, just fantastic. And fortunate to over the years have become friends with Joe Ewers, their banjo player, and just a great guy to chat with. So it's kind of neat. And so here, and then maybe this ties back to the kitsch. So the Civil War art that you mentioned, Dan, one of my goals used to be to tell the biography of Stonewall Jackson in Civil War art. So I wasn't buying like all of the Civil War Jackson stuff because there's just an avalanche of it, but like what are key moments in his life that were portrayed in canvas by different artists. And I was buying up prints, and there's just a couple still that I would need to get, but I don't have wall space for it anymore. So I sort of gave up on that one. But,
yeah.
But there's a great essay in the book that talks about the Civil War art boom and bust, and how, there was Civil War art on everything Civil War related for a long time. And that was, so recognizable, and there was such a huge market for it. And that's evaporated. When I was in Seattle, kind of hanging out with Richard Heisler from Civil War Seattle, he told me that he was an art student and that's what he wanted to do for a living. And so I got him to actually write that essay based on his own personal experience, and pretty fascinating stuff. John, let me kind of ask you to bring it back to the book to wrap us up here. As folks pick up pop culture, Civil War and pop culture, what do you hope they're going to take away from this curation of essays?
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, this isn't just kind of a list of like, here's your favorite movie or song and why it's bad, right? That's not what we're doing. There's a little bit of stuff here and there about things, the myths that it may have perpetuated in culture and the impacts it had. But really, everything in here is taking a look at, a book, a song, works of art, whether that's film, television, or a physical media in the form of art, and looking at it and seeing what its own independent value is and what it has to say about the Civil War and about the ways that we choose to remember the Civil War. And that's a little different for everything, right? But I think that in each of those things we find value in whatever that piece of popular culture is. And sometimes it's that really unique perspective, like the complicated ways in which we look back on Birth of a Nation.
Very good. It's and there are some fantastic essays that are original to this book that didn't appear as blog posts or anything. We've got John Koski talking about the Confederate flag in pop culture. I mean, boy, talk about an A-lister there. Gary Edelman talking about Civil War photography. That's right up his bailiwick, as folks know. I mean, so we got some really great pieces in here that are original to this book that explore some pretty fascinating topics as well. I'm sure I don't want to try to list off everybody. I'll forget folks for sure. But Dan, any final words of wisdom from you?
Yeah, I think it's a really fun book, enjoyable read. If you're one who's not appreciative of reading Edwin Coddington on a daily basis, or some other epic tome on strategy and tactics, this is definitely a nice change of pace. And I think a lot of folks will be surprised just how far flung pop culture and Civil War permeated into society. Everything from Birth of a Nation through, David Kincaid and Bobby Horton to Mort Kunstler, to the movies Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, to, Civil War beer glasses and shot glasses.
College football mascots.
Yeah.
College football
I was just
mascots.
about to
Chris
point out.
Mackowski's got a great essay in there. Yeah, so it's definitely a fun read. It's an illuminating read. It will definitely, for many, be one of those feel-good type books where you're reading about something that perhaps you yourself have interacted with in pop culture and in Civil War, or it is a touchstone for you as well. So I highly recommend everyone to pick up this latest volume from the Emerging Civil War 10th Anniversary series. And John and Chris here have done just an outstanding job curating these essays. And let's face it, these books look great together on a bookshelf. The spines are awesome. Our design team at Savas Beatie does just an amazing job with it. As you can see behind me, I'm a huge book guy. And sometimes you just like the appearance of some really good looking spines on your shelf. So if you've got another couple volumes in this series so far, you do not want to miss this one. Get it on that shelf and pull it out when you're looking for something a little lighter to read.
Excellent. So, Dan, thanks for being with us. John, thanks for being with us. The book is Civil War and Pop Culture from Savas Beatie as part of the Emerging Civil War 10th Anniversary series, co-edited by the fabulous John Tracey there. Excellent work, John. Congratulations. So, John, Dan, thanks so much. I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us here on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.